So thank you everyone for joining and welcome to our event. A Women's Place is in the Treasury, an evening with Anneliese Dodds. This event is hosted by the Fabian Society, by the Fabian Women Network, and by the Young Fabians. So the Young Fabians is the under 31 section of the Fabian Society, and we are a membership-driven think tank, organizes like events, great events like that one, policy debates, workshops, and many more events. So we have planned 15 more events with members of the shadow team, and we are currently working on policy papers such as the Labour Culture War, Britain, a leader in ethical artificial intelligence, and health policy in the UK. So we're always looking for people to join us, to get involved in policy work and politics. So if you want to join us, just drop us an email at info@youngfabians.org.uk or send us a message on Twitter. So yeah, I am Marian. I'm the chair of the Young Fabian Finance and Economy Network, and I'm very excited to speak to you, Anneliese. Tonight, our first female shadow chancellor. It's very exciting. Very happy to speak to you. And yeah, what we speak about today is kind of how we can get more women into politics. What do we need to do? It will be great to hear about your career history. It's like, I don't know, I always found it very inspiring to speak to successful women like you and learn from them and hear your stories. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. So the first part I would love to speak, as I mentioned, about your career. The second part of this conversation will be more focused on policies that we would need. So everyone can raise like a question. So there should be somewhere around the bottom here, a Q&A button. So you can just put in your question there, and I will later at the end pick one of the questions and kind of unmute you, and you can then kind of speak to Anneliese, ask her question directly. So kind of make it a bit, more interactive, so it's not just us talking. So yeah, I think, is there anything else, Anneliese, you want to mention? No? Perfect. So yeah, I think, then I start off, I think everyone kind of knows your career history very well, but I'm just very keen to hear what got you into politics. Like, was it always your dream, or how did it happen?
Well, first of all, thanks ever so much for such a lovely, warm introduction. And it's just brilliant to be with you all tonight. It really is. Both the Young Fabians and also the Fabian Women's Network. Really lovely that we can meet together. You know, hopefully next time it might be maybe even in the same place, who knows, but really, really good to be here. In terms of, I guess, when I first became involved in politics, it really wasn't something that looked like a career option, I guess, to me at all, actually. So for a very long time, I worked as an academic. So I worked in a number of different universities. I hadn't always known that I wanted to go into that area. Actually, interestingly enough, as a Fabian, I initially, after I did my first period of study, I went on to study social policy. So of course the example of the webs was very important to me, and evidence-driven policy making and understanding of social policy has always been of great interest to me. Anyway, I for quite a long time combined kind of activism, I guess, on the side in the Labour Party with an academic career. And then I guess that changed when a friend of mine said that they needed to find some people from across the Southeast region stand for the European Parliament. Would I be interested in doing it? At that stage, I said no. A big part of the reason for that was because I was pregnant, and I thought it would just be too difficult, pregnant for the first time. But also, I hadn't been involved in European politics before, so I thought, oh, I don't really know enough about this. But then my partner said, well, you keep complaining about, the coverage of European politics, and why don't you actually do something about it and put your kind of, I guess, your money where your mouth is. So then I went for the selection there, obviously became an MEP, which I was for a couple of years. And then actually my home constituency, so where I'm speaking to you from now, Oxford East, the sitting MP decided to stand down, and then I became the candidate, and I'm obviously really grateful to the people living here who decided to support me in the last 2 elections. But yeah, there was no plan. So I would say I'm not necessarily a very good person to give advice, but I guess perhaps the only thing I would say is that just make sure that you're doing things that you really love, because certainly I know so many good people who've been candidates for the Labour Party before, who've been officers for the Labour Party, and they're all still around. They're all still doing amazing work at local level, as well as kind of regional level. Some of them at national level, but lots more locally. So yeah, just make sure that, I guess, is the critical thing, and you can make such a difference locally, I would say, as well as nationally. Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned that you first said no, and you were a bit hesitant to take the position because you were like pregnant and all those reasons. I mean, were there any other struggles that you faced during your career, or any struggles that you think you faced because you're a woman?
I think that it's quite a different thing. I mean, obviously not always, not everywhere, not for everybody, but I think it is quite a different proposition being politically active as a woman in the Labour Party than in some of the other parties. Let's put it that way. Obviously we've always had a mission to have more female representation. We've got support for structural measures like all women shortlists, and very, very strong women within the Parliamentary Labour Party who are very keen to encourage others to become members of Parliament, councillors, activists, and office holders. So I think it's an easier prospect in many ways in the Labour Party. It's also, of course, an easier prospect in the UK compared to lots of other countries. And I've spent quite a lot of time in other countries, particularly as an MEP in Montenegro and some of the Western Balkans, other countries as well. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to get hearing, I would say, as a woman in some other nations. Obviously changing, and it depends again on the party and the context. But yeah, I do feel quite lucky from that respect.
I mean, that is good to hear that the UK is kind of more advanced than other countries in that sense, that you got a voice. But do you have any word of encouragement for women that might face struggle, that might not be able to speak up?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one area where, unfortunately, I mean, obviously there is still harassment. I don't want to suggest that there aren't still problems for many women, particularly young women, and kind of, I guess, to an extent, some of those are now being dealt with in a much more forceful manner, quite rightly, finally, through parliamentary systems, also through the Labour Party's own systems, which have changed a lot, quite rightly, and I think they're much, much more responsive and robust now than they were. I suppose one thing that I'm always concerned about, and it's much more of an issue now, I think, than when I started to be a candidate for the Labour Party and that kind of thing quite some time ago, is, I guess, some of the kind of social media kind of abuse that a lot of women get. It's obviously worse for women often than for men. It's far worse for Black and minority ethnic women or women with disabilities often than for men. And I think that's an area where really we can provide a lot of solidarity, as well as calling out that behaviour clearly and trying to deal with it appropriately and get it closed down. I think we can also try and support each other as much as possible. And that's really critical. And I think there's been some brilliant examples of that. And actually the Fabian Women's Network has been excellent at that, genuinely, and very, very good at building that solidarity amongst women.
Yeah, we will later get more to what the Fabian Women Network does. But so do you think there are things that men could do to help women be more successful? And has there been some male politician that has helped you in your career? Or is there this is kind of a role model?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there have been a lot of them, actually. And again, I feel very kind of proud of the fact that as a Labour Party, again, not always, but there's so many examples of very strong feminist men within the party. It's quite interesting, some of the academic work that's been done into this. I think, is it Claire Annesley at University of Manchester looked at when you start to get a step change in pro-women policies being passed, and she pointed out that someone like Ed Miliband, for example, actually when he was serving as an advisor, actually, so not even at that stage as a member of parliament, but very influential, making sure that policies that were promoted by women like Harriet Harman were carried right through Labour administration, and clearly they made a big impact on women's lives. So yes, I think there are a lot of them in the Labour Party, and ultimately we've got to work together.
That's very true. But still, could you give an advice to men, something they should do? For example, if you have the young Fabians, they're maybe all at the beginning of our career, what is it that our man could do to help us women to kind of succeed?
Oh goodness, that's a tricky question and an important one, and actually it would be really interesting. Go on.
You wish that would be there, when you have something? Is there something that is something okay, I wish that a man would have supported me or would have done something?
Yeah, I mean, I think quite often we can stimulate debate around some of these issues in a really productive way. So you think about the discussions around manels, for example, that's gone on, men-only panels. Now, I think actually now that's starting to create quite a lot of change, because it is, across media and in politics, having those mechanisms there is getting people to reflect and to think, well, actually, yeah, I do remember that there was a really, a really bright woman who's really knowledgeable about whatever that subject is. Let's involve them. And I think you need sometimes to have those structural mechanisms to achieve change. I'd say, actually, I've got to be quite careful what I say here. I think sometimes those who suggest that the only reason why they've never broken through is because of all women shortlists don't always do themselves favors. I think the kind of previous history where women have been underrepresented would suggest that there's something else that's been going on there. But I think there's a lot of really positive stuff going on, and we just need to keep building on that, really.
And just from now, when you think back to your career, is there anything that you would tell your younger self? Anything that you wished you would have done differently, or would have done better, or not done at all?
Goodness me, that's an interesting question, and actually it's kind of something I've been kind of reflecting on a little bit. I guess that I suppose the last 5 years of my life have kind of included such a lot of kind of activity, I guess. Gone are the days when I could, as an academic, spend a whole day working on one thing. That was kind of really lovely. So I suppose I would say to my old self, well, look, enjoy it while it lasts. It won't be there for very long. I suppose also not being afraid to ask others. I've benefited so much from advice over the years. And I suppose just lastly, one thing that I always find is that, very often, including within the Labour Party and the Fabians and other groups, people can achieve quite incredible things. And we don't always actually thank each other for doing that, or just take the time to say to others, look, I think that initiative or that speech or whatever it was, that article was really good. And I think that can make a big difference when people are starting out, to have that kind of support. I think it's if you're ever hesitating and thinking, should I write that email to say I thought this was really interesting, just do it. I would say, don't hold back.
Kind of just go for it. That's what you would recommend.
Yeah.
And something I'm very curious about, do you think your academic background helps you to be successful in your role now?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, actually. And somebody, I was doing an interview with the New Statesman, and they asked me about that. And I don't think it's just at all kind of something that comes from an academic background. I've seen it in a lot of union officers, actually, as well. People who've been in situations where there's kind of no escape, as it were. It's where you've got to get your arguments completely straight, and you've got to have the evidence there to back them up. And I think that applies across a whole range of different professions and activities, as I said. But I think that really does help, because that kind of focus, just thinking through, where could the disagreements be, where are we going to be challenged, that discipline, I think is enormously helpful. I suppose the other thing I always say, and it's completely true, is that as a lecturer, I was very used to having hundreds of people watching me and none of them being interested in what I was saying. So that kind of also provides a little bit of inoculation for some of the public speaking that you have to do, I guess, as a politician.
It must be nice now to see that you can actually change something with your work. Because sometimes I feel like with academic work, you just do the great paper and it just disappears somewhere. So it must be
no, I think that's right. I mean, I always felt there was potentially a closer link, actually, in many cases. And I guess kind of conversely, it often frustrated me that I could sometimes see academic friends of mine or colleagues where I felt they had something very important to say to policymakers, and yet that wasn't kind of cutting through. So I think it kind of goes in both directions, really. But certainly, the ability to try and change things is absolutely incredible. Of course, it comes with the frustration that so often you can't change things, and clearly that's the situation Labour's in nationally at the moment. But again, at a local level, I think we're achieving a great deal.
Perfect. And before we move on to the next section, because Young Fabians is a young organization, and most of our members are like at the beginning of the political career. Do you have like advice for the women that want to pursue a political career, like final advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I'm not sure that I'm a good one to offer advice, given my slightly kind of strange trajectory through all this. But I guess kind of one thing that I've found to be genuinely quite important is to try to I guess have that strong life outside politics as well. So for me, obviously, I find that in my academic work, and others find it in other areas. But I think, as I was kind of intimating before, that there are a lot of people who would like to end up being in that sphere where they can exercise that kind of political influence, particularly at a national level. But the chances to do that are very restricted. And I would say that, actually, in terms of the influence that an MP like me can have right now, you compare that to what a councillor could be doing, somebody working in a housing association, indeed lots of people in the private sector as well. I think we need to be open-minded about how we can make the change that we need to see. So I guess, don't kind of put all your eggs in one basket in terms of thinking there's only one way to carry out politics. Politics is about power and about changing things, in my view, as a socialist, so that everyone's got that power, not just the people at the top. And you can do that in many, many different ways, I think.
I think, it's great to hear that there's not just one way, there are different ways to change things. So thank you so much for sharing all the stories. I found it always very inspiring to hear. And I would like to invite Sarah from the Fabian Women Network, just to share the work that they do and how they help women to succeed in their political career. So welcome, Sarah.
Great, hello. Thanks so much for doing this event with us, Anneliese, and thanks to the Young Fabians for organising it all. I'm here with two hats on, so a big welcome from the main Fabian Society. It's one of my great privileges as the Fabian Women's Network Chair to sit then on the executive of the Fabian Society and report back. So it's great to have our colleague Anneliese here. We know each other from the Fabian exec, and she's been doing great work as an executive member before she got this new exciting, I don't know what was more exciting, Anneliese, being elected successfully onto the Fabian exec or becoming the Shadow Chancellor. You can answer that later, I'll leave it with you. But it's our absolute delight and pleasure to be involved in this event this evening, and we are so excited to finally have a woman in this role. There's never been a female chancellor, we've never had a female shadow chancellor, and it's really significant. We can talk about things all day long, but just that representation throughout the party at every level is so profoundly significant. So for those of you who are not as aware of the work of FWN as maybe familiar with the main society or or the Young Fabians. Just a very brief potted history. We've been around for 15 years, and we are now on our 9th cohort of mentees. We run a mentoring scheme every year for about 25 women, and it's about political and public life. So really following on from some of those things that Anneliese mentioned about not having all your eggs in one basket. It's a kind of professional and personal development mentoring scheme that obviously is absolutely rooted in the political sphere, but also looks at whether people want to become magistrates, charity trustees, and tries to take a really holistic view of women being change makers in our society, in every part of our society. And we're really proud of there's over 200 women who've done that programme now, and we're incredibly proud of all of them. We're a volunteer-run network, like the Young Fabians, and so we have our own programme of Zoom events, but we are very reliant on sisterhood to get us through. And we have a tagline at FWN, which is sisterhood, solidarity and service, and everything we do we try and hook into those values. I don't know if you can hear my small children having bath time in the background. It sounds very loud to me, so I hope you can hear me okay. And so we're looking to do events that stand in solidarity, and I think some of those points Anneliese was making earlier about, you know, within the Parliamentary Labour Party, women's representation is in a good place. 2017 and 2019 brought in quite a diverse cohort of women, actually, partly because those selection processes were done at speed and in a different way. And I think there's a deeper question there about women's representation, about whether snap elections are what it takes to get working class and BME representation up, and whether we maybe need to think about the structure of that a bit more. And I think I know that both Labour Women's Network and Fabian Women's Network are really passionate about seeing more women in local government and leading in regional government. We don't have a single female Metro Mayor at the moment. About 20% of council leaders are women. So there's still, you know, lots of work to do. And I'm always really aware as a white woman, it's about, you know, which are the women leading? Is it the white middle class university educated people that did PPE at Oxford? No offence to anybody that did, but you know, who are the women leading? Is it particularly in urban conurbations in our cities where there's a really high rate of BME residents? Why is it often our councils are so predominantly white? So there's absolutely work to do as intersectional feminists that want to stand in solidarity, and really I think the current crisis is helping us all to deeply consider what it means, what solidarity means. You know, what does socialism, what does service, what does solidarity mean at a time like this where we might live with somebody who needs shielding, but how can we encourage and lend, you know, a sisterly arm to somebody else? And being a good ally is really important to us. You were asking about how men can support women, and it's like, you know, be encouraging, get out the way, be a good ally. And as a white woman with, you know, university background, what can I be doing to encourage different types of women? I've worked in prison, and I always want to see the women that I worked with in prisons, I want to get their voices heard, you know, I want to get them a seat at the table. So trying to act as, I think, an ally and a gateway. So that is some of what FWN is about. Marion, do you want me to ask a question, or should I hand back over to you now?
I mean, yeah, thank you for sharing all what sounds very exciting what the Fabian Women Network does. It's, yeah, and I can see that you're passionate about it. It's always nice to see.
I love nothing more than encouraging other women, so it's a delight to be on a panel like this, which is basically amazing kick-ass women. It is.
Yeah, my next question to Anneliese was, is there anything else that needs to be done? Is there more that we need to, that's required to do to help women to succeed? I think you're still muted.
I'm so sorry, apologies.
Thank you.
So, I mean, within politics, I mean, I think certainly there are many things that need to change. I mean, I absolutely agree with what was just said. I mean, no question. I think there are numerous additional barriers that many women face. I mean, in fact, it's something that I'm sure many of us have talked about in our Labour Party branches, as well as in Fabian societies, etc. as well. I mean, the fact that, for example, for people with caring responsibilities, it can be quite a bit harder to participate. A lot of the time, there are the financial challenges which often arise, and there are often those issues about, you know, unfortunately, in some cases, direct discrimination that we need to deal with. So, you know, there is a lot more that needs to be achieved, and, you know, we're still behind.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the problem. We are still behind on representation, and I think, you know, it's quite right to mention the local level. That is very, very important, and we really, really desperately need to change that.
Yeah, so my next question is about the gender pay gap. So it's a very hot topic, and I think in 2019 this gender pay gap was still around 17-18%, and I think Labour has mentioned that they're planning to end the gender pay gap. It's kind of one of their key aims when they get into government, but it doesn't seem like there's any commitment in the last two manifestos. So, when women get children, like, the pay gap even gets wider. Is there anything like you would be pushing the party for changing their position, or how do you think kind of the gender pay gap can be addressed in the next manifesto?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. There's still a very persistent pay gap. Obviously, we've called for mandatory reporting, for example, so a much stronger system than exists currently. So kind of extending the reach of what came in under Theresa May. I'm really saying that, you know, any businesses where there are those differences, they need to have plans for dealing with them and actually enact those plans. You know, it's not good enough to have this at such an aspirational level. I suppose I'd also reflect that this is kind of turbocharged by what's occurring currently. If you look at who is on the furlough scheme currently, for example, you know, across many age groups, I think maybe even all age groups, actually. There was a piece in the FT about this today, the Financial Times, I believe. Women are in the majority. And therefore, obviously, they've already taken, in a very, very large number of cases, a 20% pay cut, because the furlough just covers up to 80%. They'll be the ones who'll be threatened the most with unemployment if they're not able to be retained by the companies that they were working for. So this, I think, is becoming, if anything, even more critical. Now, I suppose in a broad context, one other thing that we would do, as well as the responsibilities on business, would be to say government has got to be properly impact assessing its different interventions. You know, it's stopped doing this over recent budgets. Obviously, under Labour governments before, we had a different approach. We were properly conducting those equality impact assessments. Hasn't been happening recently, and that needs to change. And that applies actually to the measures which are being enacted around the coronavirus economic crisis, just as much as in other cases.
Despite all of that, do you think there's an opportunity for women in the crisis?
I mean, I suppose I wouldn't want to suggest that to kind of diminish, obviously, the awful suffering and pain that's going on. I suppose the crisis is getting, however, a lot of people to re-evaluate some long established kind of myths, I guess. I mean, there used to be the suggestion that somehow we had a meritocracy, to be completely honest, in this country, and that those who were doing critical jobs were paid more than those who weren't. Well, we look at the situation for care workers, where, you know, under most estimations, almost about a third of them, maybe even more, weren't even properly receiving the minimum wage when you add in all the travel time, etc. Can't possibly be the case. Anyone could say that they were being paid adequately now. And of course, that applies in many cases to retail workers and many others. So I think this is leading to a reevaluation for many people about some of those long-held views. That means it's absolutely critical, obviously, for those of us who want to see a fairer economy and society, that we set out what we want to see in the future, that we take as many people with us as possible, and that we try and change things ultimately, so we don't ever end up in this kind of situation again, you know, because we've got such enormous numbers of people in our country without the resilience to weather this economic storm. That's coming on top of the health problems, and we really shouldn't, you know, the latter, I suppose, to an extent, were going to happen, although I'd argue the government hasn't always taken the right decisions around many aspects of that health crisis. But we can do a lot more about the economic problems if we really apply ourselves.
So, like, in an ideal world, what would you apply? What kind of policies would you do if you could do whatever you wanted to do?
Well, right now, I mean, I think, I guess some of the most immediate issues are to not threaten people with withdrawing support that they're not dependent on. I mean, it's so frustrating to see this kind of language that we wrongly saw used about people who needed to use social security in the past now being slapped onto people who are seeing their wages supported through the furlough scheme. We shouldn't be talking in that way. You know, people want to be getting back to work when they can, but we need to be doing that in a way that supports them, supports business, supports the economy. You look at how other countries are doing this. You know, they're talking about retraining, they're talking about flexible schemes where people can go back part-time and then be supported through public funds to top them up. They're talking about regional policy, industrial strategies, retraining, redeployment. Sadly, we're not into that discussion yet in the UK. We really need to be. And I think there's a very distinctive Labour position on all of that, informed a lot of the time, in fact, by what local actors are calling for, which obviously I'm pushing as much as possible at national level.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There's one last question I have before we go on to Q&A. So according to the data, there's only around 2% of new parents that make use of the shared parental leave scheme, which seems very low for me. So it seems like it's still all much down to the women to like raise the children. Like, what is your take on this, and what kind of policies would you like to see to rise that number from 2% to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as you say, the stats talk for themselves. This is not a scheme that's leading to the sharing of parenting responsibilities. And again, if we compare the UK to lots of other countries, we are very, very far behind. I have to say, however, there's still a big gap in just about every country in who does the housework, I'm afraid. So, you know, again, the statistics talk for themselves. Even in nations like Denmark, for example, there's still a big gender difference around that kind of thing. But we need to get to a more equal position around parenting. You know, it's very, very important. Obviously, we'll be looking at this area as we start to develop our new policies for the next manifesto. But I think, you know, issues around both paternity leave, maternity leave, but also going into issues around childcare are going to be, again, pretty important in these kinds of discussions. You know, we're going to have to be doing all we can to reactivate people, as it were, to try and make sure that there are jobs for them to go into, enable them to access those jobs. So these kind of questions are going to be becoming really, really critical. You know, and I also think from an economic point of view, we lose so much through women, you know, both through the not having an equal sharing of parental leave, but then when those women eventually go back, so often they're going back at a level much lower than where they left the labour market in the first place when they went to have those caring responsibilities. And that's an enormous waste overall of the kind of capacity that we need in our economy.
Okay, thank you. So I think you finally move on to Q&A, so to give all our attendees a chance to speak and ask their questions. So the first question I have is from Marion Craig. So I think you're getting unmuted. So feel free to ask a question.
Hi, Anneliese. First of all, big congratulations on being elected Shadow Chancellor. My question is about the kind of cost of COVID, as it were. So even though we're still in lockdown, there's already been a discussion about how do we as a country pay for the economic impact of coronavirus. And George Osborne has suggested that austerity 2.0 is the way forward. How do we ensure that if the Tories do pursue that kind of agenda, that we ensure women are not disproportionately affected? As you pointed out, women are already in quite an insecure, precarious position. How do we ensure that they're not made even worse off?
Well, George Osborne made that kind of an argument last week. I did a kind of slightly strange socially distanced question time last week, and Osborne was there. I have to say I was quite keen to do it when I found out that he was going to be on the programme. And he said, well, there's only two things that you can do to get out of a crisis like this. Either you increase taxes or you cut spending. That's all that you can do. They're the only two choices. And I said, well, actually, that's not true. You've got very, very big choices about, first of all, how you grow the size of the economy. And we didn't see that to the extent that we should have done. From 2010 onwards, we saw a really slow recovery, very slow recovery in living standards. That meant that ultimately there was less revenue, of course, because people's incomes were increasing at a far slower rate than if we'd had a stronger recovery. So that's one big decision, what governments do to increase demand, which is going to be important. But secondly, there are enormous distributional questions, right? And of course, again, in relation to those, after 2010, the wrong decisions were taken. So the IFS analysis of successive budgets states that the top 10% of people saw their income going down by 2% because of successive budgets under Conservative ministers and governments. But actually the bottom 10% of people where they have children, they saw their income going down because of tax and benefit changes by 20% over that period. That's absolutely enormous. That was a huge distributional choice that was taken. Now we cannot have that again. And obviously I'm trying to make those points both as a Labour person, but trying to appeal much more broadly as well, and saying that this is extremely bad for our financial resilience. You know, we entered this crisis with about a quarter of families only having up to £100 in savings, no more than that. Now that is causing enormous problems for us. So even aside from the struggles that they're having, and of course many of those families will be headed by women, many of them will be single parent families, you know, women really struggling even beyond their personal situation. That's an enormous issue for us as a country and something that's going to hold back our economic recovery overall. So we absolutely have to make sure that we don't see a kind of Osborne and Conservative style response to this. Yes, eventually that cost will have to be paid off, but let's do it by growing the economic pie, by making sensible decisions, and not by that kind of punitive attitude towards those who can least afford to actually pay for some of the costs of this, which is what we've seen.
Thank you so much. Then we have another question coming in from Priscilla Mensa.
Hi there.
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Great. So thank you so much for hosting this evening, and it's honestly it's so well deserved, and congratulations to you, and thank you for your really clear and cogent responses tonight. My question was one with regards to effectively a feminist manifesto. So this would be incorporating all the things that we know work for women, but also ultimately work for everyone. So do we think potentially under your leadership we might see the first real feminist manifesto and agenda, which is focusing on, we tend to have a focus either on industry and developing of industry, so construction projects and the like. Of course, those are very important, but it's interesting that we very, very rarely see those issues that are considered women's issues to be the investment priority. So we look at infrastructure projects as an investment, but we look at things like paying our carers more as an expenditure. And I wonder what your approach would be for forging the economic agenda of the next Labour manifesto. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Priscilla. I think that's a really critical question, and you've probably seen the work that the Women's Budget Group in particular have been doing around these kinds of issues. And they've indicated how, for example, additional spending rooted into care, particularly into social care, the additional jobs that might be created by that, especially for women, are many, many more than those that might be created through construction. I mean, I actually think for our future resilience, we've got to be backing both. Incidentally, we've got to be ensuring that there are more women within those construction roles and in the driving seat around those infrastructure projects that are going to be necessary for the kind of levelling up that we need to see. Can I just say it was a Labour phrase before it was a Tory phrase, so I'm reclaiming it there. But I think that's really critically important. And I mean, it's an interesting idea actually about having a separate manifesto. I guess that's something that the party would need to look into. We need to think through that. Obviously, we've got a separate women's conference now, which I think is really effective. Whenever it can come back to its normal format, and you know, we're all hoping that we'll be in that situation soon. But I think, you know, above all for me, the critical thing has got to be that the impact on women is hardwired into all of our economic decision making. And we've seen such a reluctance to do that over recent years. We ensured there was a debate goodness, it was about, I think maybe about a year ago now, around changes to corporation tax. Now, the fact is that whether we like it or not, they will have more of a positive impact on men. That's because more men tend to be owners of businesses which tend to get above the threshold beyond which you start paying corporation tax. And if the fact that there's less money from corporation tax means there's less spending on public services, then that has an impact on women. And we were obviously trying to put forward those arguments. There's just a lack of willingness to even engage with them, I would say, from the government side. Now that has got to change. These distributional issues are absolutely critical. And I guess going back to the questions that that Marion was posing before, I think we do have a moment now to start opening up a lot of this, because people are looking at how the impact of this crisis is so unequal on different groups. And I think we've got to really build on that into the future.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Mariana Masters. Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Great. I'm trying to put my camera up. I'll just speak. Thank you very much. I wanted to know, you can't see my camera on, but I'm a BAME woman, a black woman, and very concerned with obviously the ONS figures about the COVID deaths and the effect on the black community. But obviously behind the data is a sort of structural economic inequalities. And I'd just like to know, in terms of policies going forward, what Labour policies you would like to prioritise to address this.
Yeah, Mariana, you're absolutely right. And I'm extremely disturbed actually by what we're seeing. We don't have, I would say, data yet at the granular level that's necessary, but we do know, for example, that even kind of between the ages of 15 and 64, we're seeing far higher levels of mortality from this horrible disease in the UK, and particularly in some of our urban centres, and it appears amongst Black and minority ethnic people than is occurring in any other country. And I'm absolutely appalled by this. And I think that part of the answer may well be exactly as you say, rooted in that structural disadvantage. So, people who are living in overcrowded conditions, obviously, people who are living in poverty, which has led to, in some cases, worse levels of health before this this horrible disease came along. People who often will be working in frontline roles, but not at a highly paid level, who won't necessarily have had access to the kinds of protective equipment, etc., that is so necessary. In very many cases, those people are Black and minority ethnic people. And so that difference deeply disturbs me. I know that Doreen Lawrence obviously has been commissioned by Keir Starmer to be looking into this. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a very, very significant economic aspect here. I know that she is going to be looking into that and into the circumstances around all of this. And it's going to have to be dealt with, I think, very, very strenuously. Again, we can't be in a position where, very sadly, we have large numbers of people who, through no fault of their own, have become less resilient to this disease. We have to deal with this. And so I'm really pleased that Keir commissioned that review actually with Doreen Lawrence. I think it's incredibly important.
Thank you so much. And we have another question from Craig Edwards. Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Hello. Hi everybody. The question I wanted to ask is, I live in Scotland, and Scotland is a significant concern for Labour and has been for several years, and that's unfortunately been getting worse in recent years. How can we appeal to Scottish women, and Anneliese, as a Scottish woman yourself, you might be in a unique position to answer this, and build trust that we are on their side and not the SNP?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really critical question, Craig, and things have changed so much. You know, I remember I was talking about, obviously, I mean, I always feel very embarrassed talking about my upbringing, etc. But, you know, when I was young, you know, the major division obviously was between Labour and the Conservatives. Now it's shifted, unfortunately, and we're in a very, very different set of circumstances. Obviously, we're back down to just one Labour member of Parliament. You know, we're not doing as well at all with our MSP contingent as we should be. We're also seeing quite a lot of changes with our local government representation, which have been, you know, worrying in many cases. We've got to get back to strength in Scotland. I suppose, I guess one thing that I'm absolutely determined to do is to have a much stronger relationship with the Scottish Labour Party. For example, I've reached out obviously to Jackie Baillie. She's already very much engaged in our discussions in our National Policy Forum that's been starting up again. You know, really good discussions with her on that already. And I think it's about having, you know, just having that close relationship. I also think it's very important that we don't, I've got to be careful what I say here, but, you know, that we don't ever have people kind of coming up to Scotland, not being aware sometimes the local sensitivities, you know, and, you know, I would count myself within the category of people who could do that, you know, so I'm always trying to make sure that I know exactly what's going on. I think that's so important because many of the big political issues and divides are different, actually. So it's not going to be an easy task. You know, I think some of the issues that Scottish Labour are pushing on actually are really critical ones. Some of the aspects around what's happened regionally in parts of Scotland, you know, the fact that we're not seeing that inequality necessarily decreasing at all. I think it's really important we keep pushing on that and, you know, make sure that's as resonant as possible with people. But also, of course, that it connects to women's reality as well. I think that's very, very important. I would also just say, I kind of reflecting that point as well, you know, I always want to hear from people. I'm concerned that there's a lot of questions here. If we don't get through all of them, I'm sure that Marion wouldn't mind me saying, I hope that, you know, please do drop me a line, right? If there's something that you want to ask me about or you want to put on my agenda, please don't hesitate to just drop me an email.
Thank you. It's a very kind offer. You have another question from Matthew Howard. Is he still here? Yes.
Known for your specialisation in tax avoidance and regulation. As Shadow Chancellor, how will you continue your work on clamping down on tax avoidance and regulating corporations in the UK? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question, Matthew. Can I be very, very cheeky and ask how old you are, Matthew? If that's, sorry, you're probably sick of people asking you that. But
I'm
13.
Can I ask? I'm 13.
Wow. Well, that is amazing. That is you're the youngest Fabian that I've ever met, albeit remotely. And I'm sure that everyone else on this call would want to salute your engagement and your commitment. That's absolutely fantastic. Well done for getting involved with this. Now, I suppose around tax avoidance and evasion, you know, really this is a critical issue for us to get a grip on, because sadly we still see so many resources leaving the UK. I think it's a particularly germane issue now, and in fact there's some interesting debates going on around whether public money should be provided to those who still make use of tax avoidance mechanisms. We've said that there should not be support which then is leached out into tax havens, that we shouldn't be seeing either public money being pulled out of companies through share buybacks or through dividend payments immediately. We need to have a new social contract with business going forward, and that means dealing with issues about tax avoidance and evasion, also environmental factors as well, and those kind of issues about value that I just mentioned.
Thank you. So next question is coming from Mark Storm.
Yep, hello. Hi, Anneliese. I am representing the Young Fabians Tech Network here. So we are interested very much. We're doing a big project on artificial.
You dropped off, Mark. Yes, we have you back. Hello? Now. Yeah, we have you back now.
Okay, apologies.
Yeah, let's start all over again.
So, representing the Young Fabians Tech Network, we are doing a very big project on artificial intelligence this year, and I was wondering if we could get your thoughts on AI and what specific policy ideas may you have in terms of tackling this issue, or issue, challenge, opportunity.
Wow, I mean, that's an enormous question. I heard about that project and it sounds really exciting and very important. And I've discussed a number of these issues, actually, particularly with Shion Wura, who obviously is representing Labour on many of these matters and who has herself a professional background in communications. I think one of the key issues for me is about access to these kinds of technologies. I think there are some instances where we see the development of AI by kind of challenger companies, as it were. In fact, there's one not so far away from where I am right now who actually developed a neural map approach to identifying tumours faster than Google DeepMind. But that's not happening very often. We find often it's the bigger companies with more concentrated ownership which are able to actually benefit from those technologies. So for me, there's a big question about how we can really ensure that the capacity to use them is more widely available, so that we don't have, I mean, obviously we've got a digital divide in our population, but we can't have a digital divide within companies, particularly not when it applies to AI. There are then, of course, many questions about how you use those technologies in an ethical way. I have to say, people like Chi have looked at that in much more detail than I have, so I'm often kind of guided by their thoughts around this. Of course, we've got some brilliant Fabians looking at this as well, and I'd want to kind of pay tribute to them as well. But I think that broadly, from an economic point of view, a lot of it is around how we can ensure that this developing technology develops to its full capacity, that we don't have a kind of hoarding of that capacity, and instead that all businesses are able to make use of it where feasible.
Thank you for sharing. I think it will also be very useful for Mark, your opinion, because Mark from the Tech Network, he's working on the policy paper around ethical artificial intelligence, so that's probably very useful. So I think we have time for one last question. Oh, two actually. So we have one question from Vari Tordov, and then we have one more. So Vari, you're unmuted now.
Hi, so my question's all about climate change. So I was wondering what you think in Labour we can do to ensure the rebuilding of the economy sort of post-COVID combats climate change, and more generally how we can ensure that in like Labour Manifesto, and hopefully when Labour gets into government again, we can mainstream climate in all government spending.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a critical question, and I'll try and respond quickly, but that's not to diminish its importance. And, I think, again, in some ways, we're seeing a willingness, I would say, in the UK population to potentially accept quite major changes in the way that the economy works and the way that society works in order to provide the kind of just transition, the environmental transition that we need. And I'm very encouraged by that. I think a lot of the survey evidence is suggesting that. I'm working with a number of others on our shadow front bench to think through, precisely what is the set of Labour demands around this. I mean, first, I think a lot of it is about kind of conditionality on support going forward, that we should be expecting high environmental standards from those who might be expecting public support. I think that's very important. That's what's happening in France and Denmark. Other countries should be happening here too. It's also, of course, about the technologies of the future, encouraging investment into the future and providing the jobs of the future. And, very sadly, it looks like we might have up to 9% unemployment as a result of this crisis. What can we do to try and push for a situation where there's support for people to move into those kinds of environmentally necessary jobs. I mean, obviously Labour previously was calling for a very significant retrofitting programme. We were calling for a real focus on particularly adapting housing, new interventions around the energy system so that we could quite rapidly decarbonise. I think that's absolutely critical. And just finally, obviously big discussions around areas like aviation. And, you know, we've said there, ultimately, there is going to have to be change, but we think government should be working with the sector, with local authorities, with trade unions, and saying, look, we know there's going to have to be change. There's got to be, in particular, radical reduction in emissions. How can we do this in a planned way, one where communities aren't going to feel like they're being completely cut off and kind of left to fend for themselves, but instead that planned way where we can have really the green new future that we all need. So I think it's an absolutely critical question.
Thank you. So now we have our last question. The last question is from Sean Dolan.
Hi, thank you very much. All very, very interesting. But I want to end on maybe a slightly profound note. As a sort of socialist, I'm very interested in big ideas, and a lot of the best Labour chancellors were defined by their big ideas. Now, I know you're new into the job, but I was wondering if you could tell us what your big idea would be if you moved into the Treasury.
Well, I mean, I suppose sometimes it can be harder to advance particularly big ideas when we've got the pressure of events. And of course, currently we're seeing potentially the biggest recession for hundreds of years. So that does make it more challenging. I guess my kind of key message, and maybe it is a big idea, is just to say that actually shifting our economy in whatever we want to call it, more progressive direction, more socialist direction, more collectivist direction, into the direction that so many other countries are operating by, isn't just something that will radically improve people's living standards. It's also something that actually is incredibly good for our economy overall. And I guess if there's maybe something that I will always push on is the fact that, you know, I look across not just the history of our own country, but particularly that of other nations, and I can see how far behind many of them we are on critical questions like levels of investment, regional inequality, inequality across social classes. We can do this differently. So I guess that's, if I have to say that I've got a big idea, is to say, yes, we can do this differently. By learning from other countries, we can see that this doesn't just make sense socially, it makes sense economically and in fact environmentally too.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we can round up the event. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Anneliese. It was very insightful. I really enjoyed your stories about your career. It's always nice to see someone from like academic background completely shifts into a different direction, makes the jump. And yeah, it's also great to hear the big ideas you have, and I hope to see some of them implemented. And going forward, that would be great.
Oh, great. Well, thanks ever so much, everyone. As I said, anyone who didn't get the chance to speak, do just drop us a line. Thanks very much to Marion for chairing this so well. And yeah, thanks everyone. Stay safe. Take care.